Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Hope you're all doing okay. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael. My pronouns are he, they. I'm the founder of We Create Space. A brief visual description for anyone that needs it. I am white, male presenting, in my 30s, got brown eyes, brown coiffed hair, and behind me there's an arrangement of cushions on a day bed. There's a basket with a photo frame and a plant on, and there's some mood lighting as well in the background. So, for those who are new in this space, welcome. For those who have been here before, welcome back. I will just briefly introduce We Create Space, who we are. So, we are a global collective of change makers, and we are on a mission to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus people around the world. And we do that through connecting our communities with tools, with knowledge, with a support network for self-care, for personal growth, and queer leadership. And we do that through shared experiences such as workshops, webinars like this, also through content and consultancy as well. So we are a self-funding non-profit, so we work with corporate organizations, and we use the profits that we make from that work to invest back in the community for free resources, events, and experiences. So we actually have our first Pride events coming up later this summer. We have a Pride Summit on the 13th of May, which is taking place online, and it's available for anyone who is responsible for driving change within their organization or their community and wants to really kind of equip themselves with new tools for leadership, but also for self-care as well. And you can find out more about that. I'll put a link in the chat. And we also have a retreat taking place during Pride. So it's the 4th till the 6th of July. And this is taking place in Norfolk in the UK. And it's a 3-day retreat, really aimed at kind of pausing during the quite busy month of June, July, and an opportunity to just slow down, reset, and keep going. So, on to today's event. I'm joined by some fantastic speakers who are going to be sharing some of their lived experiences on what is an incredibly important topic, and one that is, hugely kind of relevant to what's going on right now around the world, but especially in the UK. And for those who are following us on social media, or a part of our network, you will have received a statement from us, which really kind of shares our sentiment as to the recent events within the UK, and specifically in relation to the actions of the UK government, of which we completely disagree with those actions. And it really kind of saddens us and frustrates us. But I just want to make sure that it's clear that we are a trans inclusive organization. We stand with you. We welcome you into our spaces. You really enrich our spaces, and I look forward to kind of this conversation. And we won't specifically be going into necessarily the recent events, but I'm sure that will kind of maybe crop up. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Nanu, who's going to be hosting this session, and yeah, take it from there.
Thank you very much, Michael. I just want to check everyone can hear me. Yep, is that a nod? Yeah, great, fantastic. Thank you, Michael. and thank you for reminding us of why this conversation is so important, even more important today, in particular with what we're seeing happen in the UK and the backpedaling from the UK government, which claims to be a global leader. My name is Gurchaten Sandhu. Some of you may know, some people know me as Nanu. My pronouns are they, he. I've recently been appointed as the director of programs at ILGA World, which is the largest LGBTI federation, global federation, which similar to the LGBTI of the UN, or the LGBTIQ equivalent of the UN. Currently based in Geneva, Switzerland, and I identify queer in all senses. So up until then, recently I was actually working in the United Nations myself, especially on non-discrimination, and made the transition over to the civil society sector not so long. But to joining me today, I have two trailblazers who are making strides in our community and raising their voices as well. Before we go over, and I'd love for them to introduce themselves. So Jayne, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Gurchaten. I'm Jayne Ozanne. She, her, I identify as a lesbian. And in fact, if you go to my website, jayneozanne.com, you'll see it says unashamedly gay and unashamedly Christian. And I know that's one of the things we're going to be pulling out today. But my foundation, the Ozanne Foundation, works with religious organizations around the world to tackle discrimination and prejudice on the grounds of sexuality and gender identity. And a couple of years ago, we formed something called the Global Interfaith Commission on LGBT Lives that brings together senior religious leaders from around the world to speak out on issues of sexuality and gender, and to affirm and celebrate the LGBT community. I suppose our main focus is on safeguarding the LGBT community, and central to that is trying to get rid of conversion therapy, which we'll be talking more about. So I chair the Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition here in the UK, and I've set up a similar group to bring together those who have successfully brought about bans in their countries so we can learn from each other. And I'm based in Oxford. You'll see me here in my study in my house in Oxford, but obviously spend a fair bit of time in Westminster too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jayne. I'm really happy that you could join us today. We'll be hearing more from Jayne shortly. Yasir, over if you could introduce yourself, and thank you.
Great, thank you very much. It's so nice to be here. How do I follow that introduction by Jayne? But Yasser, he, him. Identify myself as gay and also proudly Muslim as well. Journalist and also lead D&I for media organizations. So I head up diversity and inclusion, both from workforce and culture, but also from content and readership. I've been doing diversity for 18 years.
Thank you very much, Yasser. Before we go into the crux of our conversation today, I just wanted to acknowledge two things. Principally, we'll be talking about a very difficult topic which includes harm and perhaps even violence, and it may be triggering for people. And if at any point you are triggered and you feel you need to leave the conversation, please do step out, or feel free to reach out to Michael or Maylis and a flag to them. The other thing we would like to acknowledge is that this conversation is only being explored through a UK perspective. And our panelist experience, who Yasser and Jayne will be talking through experiences through Abrahamic faiths. And what do I mean by Abrahamic faiths, for those who may not know, through Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, what is known as the Abrahamic faiths. We do know at We Create Space that this conversation exists globally and beyond Abrahamic faith. So it's very important to acknowledge that as well. So with that being said, the session is going to be broken into two parts. First, a discussion, and then perhaps if we have enough time, we will have some questions and answers where you will have the opportunity to share your questions or even your thoughts with us. And feel free to put them into the chat as we go along, and they will be flagged to me, and I can pick them up as we go along or at the end. So my first question, I'm going to turn to Jayne, if that's okay. Jayne, often we think about our lives as going on a journey of our queerness in a very sort of linear sort of fashion, or we think that we discover our queerness, perhaps we discover our faith first. What was it for you, and what was your trajectory in terms of your own journey and just navigating your own faith? What was your experience like, and where did conversion therapy come in for you on this journey? Thank you.
Thank you, Gurchaten. Well, unashamed book plug here. Most of my journey can be read in my book, Just Love, and it's quite a complex, a long journey, but at the heart of it, sadly, was a major conflict for me between my Christian faith. I grew up in a Christian home, but I suppose I was very keen. I got very engaged with my youth group, very evangelical, charismatic church, to the point that my parents were quite concerned about how fervent I was in the faith and wanted me to tone it down. But my faith has always been a really key part of me. And if you do happen to read my story, you'll realize that whilst I've had quite an extraordinary career, I chose at the end of my 20s to step off the career ladder and follow my faith and follow the opportunities that I had to work on something called the Archbishop's Council, where I was appointed a senior director of the Church of England in a voluntary capacity, but also then working again voluntarily and praying the money in, if you like, with some really extraordinary people. Canon Andrew White, who helped head up the Middle East, the religious track of the Middle East peace process, and indeed Baroness Caroline Cox. So I'd spent some time, often in evangelical settings, and I, if I'm honest, did not believe or did not even know that women could be gay. I mean, I'm in my mid-50s now, and I just had no real concept. I come from a little island that that women could be gay, and indeed, when I found myself falling in love for the first time in my 20s with a woman, I thought it must be a one-off. I thought it must be because I was living in Paris. I came back to England and the same thing happened again. And I then had a major conflict. How could I be created in such a way that the love I yearned for, the intimacy I yearned for, the desire to have a family, to sort of fit in with all those in my immediate community, how could I be created in such a way that actually what I really wanted was such an abomination, and what I thought was really sinful? And I did what many people do. I talk about conversion therapy in 3 phases. I carried a secret with me for many years. I daren't talk to anybody about it, apart from in my prayer life with God, begging God to take away what I saw as an evil infliction on me. And the stress of that, and carrying that secret and feeling so utterly burdened with it, but also lonely with that, took me to a place where I sadly ended up in hospital, my body really screaming under the stress of it all, the consultants trying to work out what was wrong with me, and then a full-blown breakdown. And at that point, I started reaching out to friends at church who loved me and wanted the best for me, for their help. And I went through what I call stage 2 of conversion therapy, where I had hours and years, as it turned out, of prayer for healing into my past. Most of the people around me believed that something must have happened to me, and in my emotional history, if you like, that perhaps a relationship with one of my parents. So I've been quite open in the media about, sadly, the fact that I'd been raped, and many people think, oh, well, that's why you're gay, Jayne. And so I would spend hours opening up, often with strangers, but who wanted the best for me, so they could pray into that and seek some emotional healing. And the problem with that approach, although it's done in love and it's done by well-meaning people, is that you the victim, the focus of those prayers, are always left feeling a failure. You feel the shame of the fact that you've got these feelings. You feel ashamed for having to share some of the most intimate parts of your life, often with strangers. You feel ashamed for the prayers not working, and you feel a failure because God is obviously not responding to your prayers, and you feel that that must be your fault. Indeed, you're told it's your fault. And so this weight of shame, of failure, of internalized homophobia, of self-hate is crushing. And it's that leads so many to such a poor mental health state. And for me, it took me to a place where I started seeking even more drastic interventions. So stage 3, as I call it, is when I sought out people with who believed they had special giftings in this area, deliverance ministries, exorcisms, people who felt that they could cast out a homosexual demon from me, or all sorts of demons. But that also puts you under tremendous mental anguish because you feel that the devil is in you, and that you're, it's not a happy state to live in. And it's certainly not a happy state to live in for years. I went through this for about 20 years until, sadly, again, my body just screamed to a point of it almost wanting to pack up. I was rushed into hospital with undiagnosed pains, another full-blown breakdown. And at that point, I have to be honest, I was so depressed. I could see no way out. I could see no happiness for me. I could see no future. But I got to that very, very dark place that sadly too many people get to, of fearing that the only way out was to take my life. Now, luckily, I obviously didn't choose that route, and I believed that I needed to explore who I was first. But so many of us, and we will perhaps all know people who've got to that place and they have tried to take their life. And it is that mental anguish, that mental cruel torture that so many of us are put through, particularly in our younger years, which makes conversion therapy or conversion practices so damaging and dangerous. And that's why I work so hard to make sure that we will ban them.
Jayne, wow. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your journey, your pain, and your honesty. It's very touching. I mean, there's a lot I picked up from there. And, as a person of faith, one of the things is, do we go deeper into faith to really run away from who we really are, when in fact our faiths teach us to face who we really are? And I think the other thing I learned from you was, especially with stage 1, I think many of us have found ourselves, especially when we're in faith communities. I found myself in stage 1 often, praying the gay away. And we do it to ourselves because that's what we are told, because we bring ourselves to phase 1 or stage 1 of that. And how do we prevent ourselves even getting to stage 1, to using prayer upon ourselves in a harmful way? Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Again, with you, what has been your journey, and how has that conflicted with your faith or your understanding of your faith, and how did conversion therapy play its role in your life, both internally and externally?
Thank you. I'm just going to say thanks, Jayne, because sharing your story has given me a lot of courage to talk, because as you were talking, there's so much that was relating to, but also thinking, oh my goodness, what do I share? What do I don't share? What's my story? And I've always been shy of opening up about myself stories, and what often happens is that leads to people totally misunderstanding you, because one hugely common theme that I related to Jayne, growing up, when you have these types of thoughts, and for me growing up, I thought that I was gay because I didn't have a dad in my life. So I was the youngest of 4, grew up in a conservative Pakistani Muslim single parent family in Bristol. So 2nd generation Pakistani Muslim. I think dealing with that was just a challenge in itself. Going back to that film East is East. There's so many interesting, funny parallels and anecdotes in there. That was just that was my life. So it was to do with the color of my skin. It was to do with my religion. It was to do with being a second generation person, just kind of muddling along, and then having these thoughts. And for me, I actually, for a while, I never really kind of acknowledged them. I just thought, okay, I've just got these thoughts. I've got same-sex attraction to other men. I kind of stayed in my head. I kind of was in my own head a lot. And I think that I always was pinning on those other people that had both mum and dads in their life. And I just had mum, and I had such an amazing mum. She worked 3 jobs. She said, she brought us up by herself, gave absolutely brilliant work ethic and care to us. So I just got to give her credit because she was struggling with herself. So I always was looking on the other side to say, look, what, everyone's different and I'm different. So I associated my difference to that. I think when I was about 14 to 15, between 14 and 15, I just suddenly I was lying down and I just got up off my sofa and I thought, shit, I'm gay. That was the first time I labeled it. I was like, this is not right, this is wrong. And according to what I understood of what my faith says, is that was wrong. And it's not the right path. You've got to follow this journey. You're meant to, be a good Muslim, you're meant to get married, you're meant to have kids, you're meant to do all of the things that everyone else around me was doing. So I really, really did struggle with all of this. And I actually didn't tell anyone for many, many years. I didn't tell anyone up until the age of 25. So as you can imagine, a child turning into an adult, or teenager turning into an adult, with all of these thoughts mulling around her own head is actually quite damaging and toxic, and just lack of emotional development. Until I had a relationship with someone, very short-lived relationship, who ended up breaking up with me and going off and getting married to a woman. So that left me in actually quite a bit of left me in pieces, left me in disarray. I just thought to myself, I've got huge abandonment issues. Abandoned by dad who wasn't around, not that I was his fault. Abandoned by someone because I was for the first time vulnerable. And I just thought to myself, okay, I'm not going to do this. I don't want to be vulnerable. It's a wrong path. It's not good. At that time, I was very much part of a lot of sort of, good people, actually, good people around me who I just thought were all good practicing Muslims, and I just wanted to be like them. So I traveled a lot. I would get involved in spirituality and Sufism, and I met some really good people, but I felt incredibly alone because they were all working towards living the life that everyone else was living and getting married and just, being a good Muslim. So I had this cognitive dissonance, this complete conflict of my views in my mind of being a good Muslim and living the life of a good Muslim and feeling completely opposite. And I remember I went to one of our preachers at the time, and I said, look, I think I've got a problem. Took me a huge amount of courage to get to go to him to say I've got a problem. And he said, what's the issue? And I said, well, I'm struggling to get married. So he thought I had erectile dysfunction and suggested I take certain medication. I was like, no, it's not that. I don't think I find women attractive. And that was as far as I could go with saying and coming out I was gay. So that didn't go anywhere. So I actually actively sought conversion therapy because I just thought this is something I need to do to go fix myself. In a way, there was no pressure for me to go to. The pressure was created by myself. And when I did finally start to tell a few close friends it was completely alien to them, they probably were pretty, they didn't understand it, they didn't really agree with it, but they obviously cared for me as their friend. So they were supportive of me to go pursue that path to try to change. And I was told that it's wrong, it's a thought that you put in your head, don't look at pornographic material, and every time you have a thought, let it go in one ear, go out the other ear. And we have a role model, and we have a kind of a model, organized structure in how we meant to live, and just go off and do that. So clearly, obviously, that didn't work. And my story is a little bit, and I apologize because I'm talking quite a bit. My story is a little bit of a full circle, because where I began with faith not really playing a part in my identity of, coming out or being myself or letting people live, I came full circle in that so much diversity within our faith, and I really did go off my journey through personal, experiences which were quite unhealthy relationships. Because one thing you don't realize is when you don't have that maturity and development, then you're out into the wild world and to the wild west with other traumatized gays. It's cannibalization. Add in the element of race, then it's racism as well as that as well. And, I'm not ashamed to mention that, because I think unfortunately there's some brilliant stuff within our community, but there's also not some great stuff around the victim becoming the oppressor as well. So my journey around coming out was first and foremost to come out to myself and really create my connection with my faith, and not necessarily seeking approval from others, but finding others like me who had similar journeys. Because one thing I realized is that, the way in which we talk about faith and religion is all personal. It's about your personal connection to God, and really, loving yourself and how you project and view God. And I think that is my full circle of reconciling my faith and my identity.
Thank you, Yasir. Thank you for sharing that very unique perspective of, the hurt, how we're made to feel that because there's that because we're different, and therefore those differences are left to some inadequacies or spaces in our lives, or different upbringings or different events that happened, when rather than that is just who we are without any explanation. And that society always looks to those inadequacies as a way to justifying that's the way you are, rather than just saying that it is who they are without having to look at that. And how we seek out help and support when in fact it could end up harming us as well. Jayne, I want to come to you. What do you think is often overlooked when we address conversion therapy?
A really good question, Gurchaten, and I wonder, I'm probably going to share some charts, if I may. I don't know if I can share screen, but we did some research back in 2018 amongst the LGBT community, particularly the LGBT community of faith here in the UK. I've repeated this research amongst the trans community recently, and indeed in Hungary and the Caribbean. It was a whole report. I'll put the link in the chat. It's called the Faith and Sexuality Survey. And we oversaw that with a quite eminent group of research and statistical professors and stuff. So it was as independent as we could make it. But we were trying to understand a bit more about conversion therapy. And there is sadly, even still in the UK, a proportion of people who are forced through it. And, that is absolutely wrong and must be stopped. But as both Yasir and myself have explained, there is a very large proportion who voluntarily consider it, and did so because we thought it was the right thing to do, that everybody around us thought it was the right thing to do. In fact, I thought it was the only thing to do and the godly thing to do. And actually, what we need to ensure when we have a ban is that we don't allow a loophole for consent. You cannot consent to abuse. I did not know the harm I was doing to myself. And in the same way as we have protections for, dare I say, other forms of abuse like female genital mutilation or other things which cause harm, you cannot allow for consent. And it's critical that we don't allow that loophole in future legislation. We looked at who was advising and forcing. And obviously what came strongly out of this research was the role of religious leaders and religious friends. That's the yellow and the light blue. Parents also very implicated, about a third, but the religious leader has a significant role. And this was across all faiths. And this is the bit of the taboo problem. How do we dress religious practices? We asked, who did you go to for advice? Who did you tell that you were struggling? And again, religious leader, the person of authority, spiritual authority, was the most frequently asked person. And there's a whole education I think project here, particularly around the harm that this can lead to. But in the UK today, it's very rare for people to go to the medical professions. You know, you can see here in the middle, GPs, only 5%, NHS. It is primarily an issue that impacts people of faith. And when we asked how old people were when they first started going through it, well, over a half were under 18, which makes this a safeguarding children issue. But there's also this group, the large line here, 32% young adults. And so when the government was originally thinking of just looking at this for children under 18s, we were very concerned, because actually it's often when young people have left home, when they've gone to university, when they're in those impressionable early years, you know, of perhaps self-discovery, they too need protecting. We asked why people had gone through it, and here you see that sort of level of internalized homophobia and shame and self-hatred. 72% believing that who they are is sinful. Nearly 2/3 being ashamed of their desires, and the impact on the psyche of that, as we've already both said, is really quite key. You won't be surprised that the vast majority of people thought it didn't work. Some of us thought it did work. I put myself in this category, and then it wore off. And it would be important to say that there are a couple of people who do believe it worked completely and actually identified as being straight as a result. But the big question for society is, do you allow scope for so much abuse, so much pain, so much dangerous practice for the sake of a few who actually think it might work? Now, this is perhaps the key chart. What was the impact on people's mental health? Now, I have to be honest, in this particular research study, we didn't have a base, if you like. We can't compare what the mental health outcomes of just being LGBT if you hadn't been through conversion therapy were like. But I think everyone will recognize that 2/3 of people having suicidal thoughts after they've been through conversion therapy is an exceptionally high rate. You know, 1/3, 32%, attempting suicide. And obviously significant high results in self-harm and anxiety and depression. The one figure we can't measure, and I'm keen for the government to start looking at measuring, is sadly the completed suicide rate. We're convinced that a large number of suicides, sadly, in the UK will track back to this, and we need to understand perhaps their religious and their cultural or ethnic origins in order to understand if there's a link there. So, sorry, lots of stats, but, you know, consents, can't allow consent, must be young adults too, and we need to look at how we deal with this sensitive issue of religion and cultural leaders.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's with that data that we can only bring about change, and it's critical. It's one thing that only politicians and leaders look at, and when interests them is the numbers and the figures. And we have a picture here that shows it's not just in the UK, it's across Europe and it's in the Caribbean too. Thank you very much, Jayne, for presenting that work. Yeah, so if we can come to you, and you mentioned this already in some of your journey, and the intersectional nuances that you had. What are the most important considerations for you, do you think, there, you know, when it comes to conversion therapy, especially when it comes to intersectionality?
So that's a really it's a good question. It's a big question. Look, I think for me, those slides are so powerful because of the knock-on effects, whether it's eating disorders, suicide, mental health. It really plays out in quite insidious ways. One thing I think that we've got to be careful of when you support people through coming out, I would say, is also that, you know, I think there's a lot of bias around how queer people are, and I think we've got to be really careful that everyone has their own story and everyone has their own way of coming out. Not everyone has to be an activist. and no one should ever be forced or pushed to come out. So I'll give you an example. When I was in my head of diversity and inclusion role at The Guardian, I went on a date with a Dutch journalist and I wasn't out at the time, and he then outed me at work. And one of my colleagues, I won't describe him, but it was a very sort of quite cliched version of what you think someone would be, said, if you don't out yourself, I'm going to out you at work. And I was like terrified to be pushed to come out, because it was their version of being out, which is like all the cupcakes and rainbows, and which is fine, it's great, but not everyone's like that. There's different versions, and I always saw myself as me, who just so happens to be gay, as opposed to there's this gay as a badge. And I think so that whole victim becomes the oppressor bit. I think it's really important. So there's so many different versions, and and to my personal experience, and as Jayne just talked about in the slides, a lot of people do go towards it sometimes themselves because they think that's the right thing to do and that's the only way out. I think when I do say that, we do get judged quite a bit for being incredibly self-loathing, which of course, like, there is that, and it's totally understandable why people are coming from that place. So I think there's just a sensitivity in the way we've got to put the mirror towards the mainstream gay community, who are more advanced and out in the pursuit of equality and liberalization. Let's not become cannibals, because I just think there's the softness and kindness that needs to happen. I think once George Floyd happened, the whole lens on racism and micro behaviors and societal structures and all of the lived experiences that people talked about, those real subtle feelings of being treated differently because of the color of the skin, came out. Not so long before that, if you would talk about your experiences, whether it's a person of color, whether you're an LGBTQ background, to say, I just feel I'm being treated differently, it's just subtle things. More often than not, the response you'd get, from people is, are you sure? I don't see that. And you think to yourself, well, you're not from that background, of course you won't see and feel that. And then it's pushed back on you in terms of a sense of paranoia. So I think when people start talking about their experiences of, whether it's letting people in or coming out, however they want to do it, I do think we've got to have an element of sensitivity. Often people will associate not coming out with being a coward, or feeling the need to go 0 to 60, to say to your family, you either accept me and my partner or bye. It often doesn't work like that. People sometimes want a halfway ground. They want to keep their family and they know coming out that this isn't, unfortunately, in some cases, it's not EastEnders where you'd come out and the family will accept it. Some families will never accept it. Some will do because they always have God on their side. So I think it's just all of the nuances, all of the different versions, and just ensuring that there isn't one way to come out. There are so many different ways. And for us to, hold the mirror to ourselves, to be kind to others.
Thank you. Yes, so I think, you touch on a really, really interesting point there, that often there's only one version of coming out, and there's, and that one version of coming out doesn't often, or this one model of being queer or gay, I wouldn't even say queer, but gay, doesn't fit into the mold, or what I would call not heteronormativity, but homonormativity, right? That you can't be of faith. And you touched on that, ever so delicately, where we're talking about how, how do we both be of faith? It was an earlier conversation in We Create Space that happened earlier this year. But then also, how do we be queer? How do those two things match up and align up? And a lot of people in the gay community don't get it. You look at people and they say, well, the questions I had was, well, can you be gay? Does your faith allow it? You automatically see your turban or see your faith and put 2 and 2 together and get 5 or 6, or so thank you for mentioning that. But I think that leads on to another question, is that, because we are of faith and we grow up in faith, but at the same time our faith has been used against us to harm ourselves. or create harm to ourselves. How do we reconcile that? How do we still go back to faith? Because, you know, in some aspects you're told to fear God, or that you are sinful because in front of God, and then that faith is used against you. How has it brought you back to that faith? I mean, for me, I think learning more about my sexuality has brought me back to my faith. It wasn't the other way around. It was, you know, for often you think, you know, your faith will help you learn about your sexuality. Actually, my sexuality has helped me learn more about my faith. How have you reconciled that? Perhaps Jayne, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, these are really big questions, aren't they? And to be honest, we could probably spend an hour on this. I think it would be fair to say that I had to go back and rediscover the core of my faith and what I believe who God is and how God relates to me. And I had to unpick a lot of teachings and truths that I'd been told were absolutely, you know, certainties, which when I went back to scripture, because I think that's where, you know, we all start, is our understanding of scripture and our understanding of the nature of God, I began to see them with, dare I say, more grown-up eyes, but also understanding that some of what I'd been taught just wasn't true. I needed to go back and look at the Hebrew and Greek text for myself. But core to it all were three key things. God, I believe, creates us in all our diversity. That is the beauty of creation. However you define God, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, to quote the psalmist. And I don't believe God makes mistakes. And so if I believe that the beauty is to be diverse, we have to accept and celebrate that. But we are all equally loved and we all bear the same image of God. And that's what, you know, the common thing. But understanding the nature of God being love and not causing us pain, I can't believe in a God who creates us in such a way that we are tormented, that we take ourselves to a point of death. And when I look at, so this is the second point for me, I looked at the fruit of the teaching I had sat under, which took me to a point of death. And then I looked at the fruit of me being allowed to live and love in the way that I was created. And I saw the fruits of what I call the spirit, you know, joy, happiness, peace. You know, it was written on my face. Anybody near me could see when I fell in love and was allowed to love that I had come fully alive. And that is testimony itself. But the third point is actually going back and doing some theology and realizing that there are hundreds, if not tens of thousands of people now who've been in the same place that I was. I thought I was the only gay Christian in the world back in the 80s and 90s. Now I know I'm amongst millions, and hearing their stories, understanding their understanding of scripture, and recognizing that God is so much bigger than the boxes that we sometimes put God in. Sorry, that's a bit of a waffly answer, but I suppose coming back to the really simple truth that God is love and loves me passionately and wants and celebrates love, and that I am loved, I am lovable, and that's yeah, God doesn't make mistakes.
Thank you very much. Right, okay, we've only got a little bit left. Guess here, yeah, wow, Jayne, you just he gut punched me there with what you said. Indeed, that is so true. Yes, sir, how have you reconciled your faith and your sexuality and you know, dealing with conversion therapy as well, where you've sought to, you know, where faith has been used against you to even change the very core of you?
Just how Jayne so beautifully said it. It's I think that we often project our own internalized homophobia onto what we think how God views us, and then obviously there's a wider community and misunderstanding and just obviously different types of views on how people should be living their lives. So I think I said at the beginning I came full circle, because coming back to my faith is what actually made me feel comfortable with myself and being sort of happy with where I'm at in life, where I'm at with my identity, the way I live my life, which is, merging the two worlds together. And I think for me, that is probably the healthiest part. And if any advice I have to anyone, whatever their views and beliefs and values are, there isn't a way to be part of a religious community. There isn't a way to be part of a LGBT community. There's just about finding your own path, which often will be a mixture of many different things. And you'll find others out there as well. And just be happy with that. And sometimes it means probably being a little bit lonely and alone for a bit, but that's necessary to get to the place that you need to get to.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. And I like that, the full circle journey. I could share that with you on another coffee conversation with you over a cup of tea about that, how we often do go full circle with this. Okay, so we're now going to hand it over to our participants. I mean, there's quite a few of us listening in today. So do you have questions or comments you'd like to share with our panelists, Jayne and Yazir, today? If so, please send them through the chat or the Q&A, please. We do have one from Era. Era, great to see you here. Do you see a trend with weaponization of faith and D&I to drive political and other agendas which are not tolerant and self-serving for particular groups? So do you see a trend with weaponization of faith and DEI to drive political and other agendas which are not tolerant and self-serving for particular groups? Yes, yeah, you're the DEI consultant, so I'm going to go to you first with this one. What do you think?
Do you mind just reading that question again? Because I'm just trying to process it.
Do you see a trend with weaponization of faith and DEI, diversity, equality, inclusion, to drive political and other agendas which are not tolerant and self-serving for particular groups?
Yes. Okay, so I think I understand the question. So I think we're living in a world of activism, identity, politics, difference, creating a level playing field, equity, equality. I mean, there's like just a lot in that. And the challenge is really creating spaces and really valuing and ensuring that regardless of the background, you're not treated differently or discriminated against and then valued and then included and da 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 da. So people can really belong to whichever environment they're in. There are, I think what's going on is there's some real tensions between certain diversity groups. I'm being very vague specifically, because, and hopefully Jayne and I are testament to this, there isn't this dissonance, cognitive dissonance between your faith and your sexuality. I think that there is. And in order to be an activist, an LGBTQ activist, you can't be part of faith, for example, faith community, because they're homophobic. And rather than looking at the institutions as opposed to personal connection with God, unfortunately, we're just living in a really precarious time in that there's just a lot of lived experiences and a lot of people talking about various forms of discrimination and injustice. And I think what's happening is it's creating a pecking order. And what about me? What about this? And feeling like an attention on one particular aspect of this whole diversity spectrum will then be at the expense of the others. So, look, I mean, the way I see it, most organizations are wanting to do the right thing. Most organizations are nervous around how they're viewed to the outside world in terms of attracting the best talent, in terms of their brand, in terms of their product, whatever they're doing. So there's a nervousness around that. And then also, sort of most modern day employees are now have expectations on organizations to live by values of equity. And I think that's creating a lot of tension because these are wider societal issues that are going on, which require society and governments and policy, as well as organizations to play their part.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. I think you're onto something definitely there. There is a way that people are using this either for their political agendas or any other agendas, even if there's no political agenda attached, to weaponize our own identities against us. One part of my identity is being used to attack my other part of my identity. And it's being it's being armed and equipped by other communities to divide us and rule over us. And we know where that all comes from. That comes from colonialization. Jayne, would you like to any add to that?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. I think it's there's probably the question has got unspoken questions as well. We've got war on sadly. Oh gosh, how do we say it? So in the UK, when you get a charity being formed, which is supposedly to represent lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, but actually is about something completely different, that is trying to weaponize certain parts of a gender spectrum, and is really unhealthy and unhelpful. And there are religious groups behind that and involved with that. But one of the outworkings, this is perhaps a slightly different dimension, is the need to ban certain types of religious practices. And I speak as a Christian, I speak as a member of the General Synod, I speak as someone who led a debate in the Church of England, who themselves called for a ban on conversion therapy. But it does mean that we have to look at this really complex area of religious freedom and whether that can be curtailed. And we brought together a group of international human rights lawyers to look at this question, many of whom were people of faith. I think there is a lot that tries to drive a wedge between people of faith and people of from the LGBTI community. And what my foundation tries to do is to bring those two together and to network those religious leaders who want to celebrate and affirm the LGBT community and indeed safeguard them. And if we've got time, we might not, Nanu, but I'd love to share the video of the declaration that we created, which hundreds of religious leaders around the world have now signed, which wanted to apologize to the LGBT community and then actually call on the international community to act. And it might be a nice way to end if we've got a couple of minutes.
Sadly not, Jayne. I mean, if you could put the hyperlink in there.
Yeah, I will. I really urge people to read it.
Pop the link in there because we've got about 3 minutes left and I need to wrap up. If you pop the link into that, I think people can then watch that there. Thank you. I've seen the video myself and I do encourage everyone to watch it, and it's very, very powerful, especially to understand an apology of, from the very people that was, from our communities trying to protect us, was serving us and serving our faiths. With that being said, we've only got 3 minutes left, and I think it's time to wrap up. And a lot of you give some very, very good points. I just want to acknowledge them. There was one that said we need to go beyond the political above. There's a lot of blame culture from right to left and vice versa. That's awful, silly, unimportant pursuits. True religion has no political stand. Render to Caesar what his and to God what's God's. So a very important point there. Others encouraging us to look at Amral Al-Qadi's talk on TEDx. And another important point about that every mental health professional and therapist that they've worked with has pathologized their sexuality and gender and are currently training to be a therapist. The ban matters because while it won't directly affect these practitioners, it sends an important message to them. Okay, so we're just gonna roll up. Thank you very much. So today has been a very honest and insightful journey, and honest conversations have been had about what conversion therapy does to people, does to our bodies, our minds, and to our faith, and what it does to our communities. So I really want to say a heartfelt thanks to Jayne and to Yazir for sharing your personal journey that you've been through. It's not easy. Especially when you have to do it on so many occasions, on so many platforms. So we'd like to thank you for your leadership in this as well. With that, I'd also like to thank We Create Space for giving us the opportunity to discuss this very, very important topic and such a timely event. We had planned this way before the conversion ban happened. This was from last year when this discussion happened, and it's more important than ever now. So it wasn't that we're doing this because of what's going on. This was on our radar for a very, very long time. So thank you very much to Michael and to Maylis, and again, Jayne and to Yazir. Over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo that thanks. Thank you so much, Jayne and Yasir. I really appreciate it. And yeah, it's been really incredible just getting to know you a bit more over the last 60 minutes. Nanu, thank you as always for your support. Really appreciate it. You're always there for me, so thank you. For everyone else, if you would like to join us again, we do have our next Queer Leadership 101 webinar, which is taking place on the 3rd of May, where we're going to be sharing some thoughts on how we can grow our empathetic leadership skills. And Queer Perspectives is back on the 19th of May with 4 more queer leaders, and we're going to be discussing LGBTQ+ mental health and addiction. For those of you in the UK, enjoy your afternoon, and yeah, hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.